So here's where we left off. The supposition prevails here, too, that the system that simplified the object, the Sache, was taken to be the system inherent in that object itself, and we can safely assume that our traditional treatment of dissonance, although originally based on a correct intuition, nevertheless proceeded more to develop the system of simplification than really to reach an understanding of the nature of dissonance. Perhaps I fall into the same error if I retain here this same manner of handling dissonance, but I can cite two considerations in my favor. First, I give the instructions necessary for complying with the system, but not, as I have often emphasized, as rules, nor as aesthetics. And the second consideration is that our present-day ear has been educated not only by the conditions nature imposed on it, but also by those produced by the system, which has become a second nature. At present we can hardly, or just gradually, escape the effects of this artificial cultural product, and reflection on nature may have value for the theory of knowledge without being thereby necessarily capable of bearing immediate artistic fruits. It is certain that this path, too, will be taken again sooner or later, the path that leads to new secrets of nature. It is certain that these, too, will then again be thinned out to make a system, but before anything, the old system has to be got out of the way. The line of thought, the erkenntnis I have presented here, can perhaps serve as a means to that end. The notation of dissonances, brought about by passing tones, may have led to the confirmation of the phenomenon of dissonance itself. Two impulses struggle with each other within man: the demand for repetition of pleasant stimuli, and the opposing desire for variety, for change, for a new stimulus. These two impulses often unite in one relatively common impulse characteristic of beasts of prey, the impulse to take possession. The question whether then repetition or change shall follow is for the time being cast aside. The more robust satisfaction the consciousness of possession gives, with its possibilities for deciding this way or that, is capable of suppressing the subtler considerations and of leading to that conservative repose which is always characteristic of ownership. Faced with the dilemma whether repetition of the stimuli or innovation be preferable, the human intellect decided here too to take possession. It founded a system. Thus it can also be imagined how the chance occurrence of a dissonant passing tone, once established by the notation, after its excitement had been experienced, called forth the desire for less accidental, less arbitrary repetition, how the desire to experience this excitement more often led to taking possession of the methods that brought it about. But should the excitement of the forbidden lead to uninhibited indulgence, that essentially despicable compromise between morality and immoderate desire had to be drawn. That compromise which here consists in a looser conception of the prohibition as well as of that which is prohibited. dissonance was accepted, but the door through which it was admitted was bolted whenever excess threatened. The treatment of dissonance, in which psychological and practical considerations play similarly decisive roles, could have arisen in this manner. The caution of the listener, who wants to enjoy the excitement but does not want to be too greatly alarmed by the danger, is in accord with the caution of the singer. And the composer, who dares not spoil it for either, invents methods that pander to this goal. How do I hold the listener in suspense? How do I startle him and yet not go so far that it is no longer possible for me to say, "It was only in fun"? Or, how do I introduce, slowly and carefully, what indeed has to come if I do not want to bore the listener? How do I persuade him to accept the sour grapes, too, so that the sweet ones, the resolution of dissonance, will stimulate him so much the more pleasantly? How do I induce the singer to sing a dissonant tone in spite of himself, in spite of possible intonation difficulties? I do not let him notice its entry, and I whisper to him in the catastrophic moment, "Easy! It's practically over." Careful introduction and euphonious resolution, that is the system. Preparation and resolution are thus a pair of protective wrappers in which the dissonance is carefully packed so that it neither suffers nor inflicts damage. Now, applied to our present case, to the diminished triad, this means that the dissonant diminished fifth will be prepared and resolved. That in the diminished triad the dissonance cannot be some tone other than the fifth follows not only from comparison with the overtones, where a fundamental always has a perfect fifth, but also from comparison with the other triads, which all have perfect fifths. There are various kinds of dissonance treatment, various kinds of resolutions above all, but also various kinds of introductions. The first and simplest form of introduction we will meet is the preparation. Here the tone that is to become dissonant should already be sung by the same voice in the preceding chord as a consonance. The purpose of this preparation is clearly as follows. To introduce the tone first where, as a consonant component of a major or minor triad, it will cause the singer no difficulty, and then to sustain it while the other voices move in such a way that it turns into a dissonance. As our first form of resolution, we will use a method whose practicality is, from a psychological viewpoint, easy to see. Namely, if a barrier is set against the harmonic flow through insertion of the dissonance, somewhat comparable to a dam in a brook, then this resistance should create an accumulation of energy that takes the obstruction, so to speak, in full swing. An energetic move should be used to get over the barrier. The leap from the fifth degree to the first can be regarded as just such an energetic move. Expressed more generally, this is the leap of the fundamental to the fourth above. This star here says it would actually be better for me to say leap to the fifth below. For the reasons given in the note on page 116, I prefer the terminology here. Okay? I have already pointed out in my critique of the notion of dominant how strong an attraction the tonic exerts on the dominant. I mentioned further that every fundamental tone has the tendency to be overpowered, to be overcome by a fundamental tone of fifth below. If we give in to this tendency of the fundamental, to its tendency towards resolution into a higher, stronger unit in which it becomes a subordinate component, to its tendency to serve a cause greater than its own, then we fulfill, as it were, the most urgent yearning of the fundamental, that is, we make the strongest leap. It is thus clear that the use of this the strongest leap on such a special occasion, as is the appearance of a dissonance in our harmonic life of the moment, is required just as much as, say, putting on holiday clothes for festival occasions in civic life. Of course, there are also other means by which dissonance can be resolved, and once it has lost, through frequent use, some of the uncommonness it now has for us, we shall handle it less ceremoniously, and shall not always immediately seize upon the strongest means. If in resolving the dissonant fifth of the diminished triad we make the root jump to the fourth above, or to the fifth below, then the chord that resolves the seventh is that of the third degree. Footnote 1 here says, in his efforts to be systematic and to keep the pupil under strict discipline, Schoenberg presents here an unusual resolution of the diminished triad on 7, postponing until later in chapter 8 the more common treatment. Okay. So here is example 12. The dissonant tone itself is resolved here by moving it a step downward from F to E. There are different ways in which the dissonance can relate to the chord of resolution. It can fall, rise, or remain stationary, but it can also move away by a leap. For our first example, we choose to let it fall, that is, move by step to the next scale tone below. One reason for this procedure is that this voice, which has drawn so great attention to itself, becomes then the octave of that fundamental we have found to be eminently suitable for resolving dissonance. This voice thus confirms, so to speak, the fulfillment of the tendency of the fundamental. But there is another reason as well, which we will have opportunity to explain later in pages 81 to 82. Here we sometimes have to do without the common tone, if we are to get a complete chord. If the common tone, the B, is sustained, example 12, B, C, and D, then the voice that has D is compelled to leap to the G above or below. This leap will often create difficulty, as for example in 12B, where, because of the downward leap, the alto goes below the tenor, or where, if the alto proceeded to the higher G, it would go above the soprano. But, as I have already said on page 40, we should avoid the crossing of voices. The solution 12C is good and useful, only it will be necessary, since here the upper voice moves by leap, to devote some care to its melodic line, to what follows. On the other hand, the progression in 12D produces too great a separation of two neighboring voices, no matter whether the alto springs upward or downward. In the first case, alto and tenor are a tenth apart. In the second, alto and soprano. We shall always avoid that sort of spacing whenever possible, for, as experience teaches, it yields a less balanced sound. Whenever something of this sort appears in the music literature, it may have been planned that way, or it may have happened as a byproduct of other, more important aims. Here, then, the solution given in 12E, without sustaining the common tone, is preferable. The pupil may use the common tone one time and do without it another, according to the requirements of the phrase. What considerations are relevant here will be analyzed later when the melodic tendencies of the parts are discussed. For the moment, let me merely suggest that it will be best not to stray too far from the spacing with which the phrase began, and Whenever there has to be a departure from that spacing, return to it upon the first opportunity. Here we have occasion to make a rather important observation. For the first assignments, we chose to write only those chord progressions that permitted the sustaining of a common tone. That seemed then to be a rule, but it is not. Its purpose was rather just to ensure the doubling of the octave, the root, and to avoid certain other difficulties in voice leading, which will be discussed later. Now it becomes occasionally necessary to disregard the common tone. Thus, the earlier instruction is suspended by a higher necessity. We are not making an exception to the rule, because we had no rule. We had an instruction, which gave just as much as it took. Certain errors could be avoided, for although the instruction did exclude some things that might be good, it also excluded others through which the errors could arise. Once the pupil has attained sufficient mastery within this restriction, and whenever higher necessity requires, he can do without this simplification. In general, we shall indeed continue the practice of allowing the voices to move only as much or as little as is absolutely necessary. Nevertheless, and this should be said here, every instruction is suspended whenever a higher necessity so requires. Thus, here there are no eternal laws, only instructions, which have relevance as long as they are not suspended, wholly or in part, by others, that is, whenever other conditions are imposed. Concerning the question, which tone of the seventh degree triad is suitable for doubling, the following is to be said. We shall of course prefer the root, simply because we have been working up to now just with root doublings, but then also for the same reason that we preferred the root in the other triads. As for the third and fifth, that is another matter. The third now takes precedence over the fifth because the seventh degree is neither major nor minor, but a diminished triad. Here the third does not determine mode, and is therefore less noticeable. The fifth, on the other hand, as a dissonance, is the most noticeable tone of the seventh degree, and would not be doubled for that reason alone. Moreover, as a dissonance that we shall resolve, it is compelled to move a certain way, that is, a step downward. Should we double it, then the other voice in which it appeared would also be obligated to move a step downward, like in 12F. Thereby, a certain voice leading would result, concerning which more is to be said later. For the present, it is enough to say that two voices would carry out the same step. This is superfluous, because one is enough. The diminished fifth is therefore not to be doubled. Now the preparation. The dissonant tone is to have been consonant in the preceding chord, and then is to be sustained in the same voice while becoming a dissonance. Each tone of the scale appears in 3 different diatonic triads, once as the root, once as the third, and once as the fifth. Our dissonant F is the root of 4, third of 2, and fifth of 7. Hence, the chords on the fourth and second degrees are available to us as preparatory chords. To the 3 questions from page 40F that we set up as guidelines for connecting consonant chords, a new one is now added. The questions therefore now read: 1. Which tone is the bass tone? 2. Which tone is dissonant? If there is a dissonance, then preparation or resolution, whichever is of immediate concern. 3. Common tone? sustained wherever possible, thus no longer invariably. And 4. Which tone is missing, or which tones? Example 13 shows several preparations and resolutions. In 13a, b, and c, the preparation is accomplished by means of the 4th degree, since here the tone to be prepared is the octave of the preparatory chord. This is called preparation by means of the octave. In 13d and e, by means of the 2nd degree, preparation by means of the 3rd. The pupil should now practice the preparation and resolution of the 7th degree in as many examples as possible. In other keys, too. The degree progressions will read 4, 7, 3 or 2, 7, 3. After 7, we shall use for the moment nothing else but 3. Before 7, only 4 or 2. Once the pupil has sufficient skill in handling the 7th degree, he should then proceed to use it in little phrases. It goes without saying that here, too, 3 must always follow 7. 4 or 2 must introduce it. As for the rest, the pupil can be completely governed by the table on page 39, in which the restrictions pertaining to the 7th degree are now discarded. We'll continue, God willing, next time with the inversions of the triads on page 52.